It's great to see you all. And so my name is Richard Quinones. I serve as the Senior Vice President for our SLED practice with a wonderful company called iBoss Cybersecurity, and I think I'm preempting my colleague who was going to make the initial remarks, and so let me pivot back to Tom Monreal. Tom?
Thanks, Richard, and yeah, you're kind of stealing my thunder there. So I'm glad you all could make it into the final two rows there, and anyway, no, again, yeah, my name is Tom Monreal. I'm an account executive for iBoss, and I will be kind of moderating, and my featured speakers are Richard Quinones, who already announced himself, as well as Ron Chandler, who's an executive advisor for iBoss, also the current CIO for UCLA Anderson School of Business. Between the two, there's over 40 years of C-level experience at the state, local, and national level. So they'll be doing the heavy lifting today, and I'll just kind of try to keep things on course. The presentation, oh, there we go. I'll start just by going over the general topics of what we're going to cover, and we'll try to keep this interactive. So, you know, being that there's a small group here, feel free to jump in if you have questions and whatnot. But to start, we're going to be going over the industry insights, and these are just general observations that we've pulled from the field, as well as from the gentleman over here's the expertise, and just general landscape for state and local government as we see it today. Moving on, we'll get into both the challenges and benefits of cloud in general, not necessarily security, but just kind of setting the framework there, and then more of a deeper dive into the actual nuances of cloud security, the impact from an integration perspective, and all the way through. And hopefully you walk away, we're going to go into our key recommendations, and you walk away from this presentation with a good understanding of from folks who have lived in your shoes and gone through this sort of thing, and hopefully that helps you, enable you as you look into your own security infrastructure. And then finally, time permitting, spend a few minutes just around the solutions that are available to go along with that. So with that said, I'm going to kick things off, pass it back to my buddies over here. And again, just start with some of the general insights that we've found across the industry, guys.
Yeah, well, I think before we even jump into that, I'd just like to make a very quick comment. No one told me when I was studying, and I don't mean to drop degrees here, but when I was studying from a graduate degree, fortunate enough to go to graduate school and get an MPA, no one told me how difficult it would be in the real world relative to implementing some of these innovations that are really changing the way our citizenry are engaging city government. I mean, it is truly amazing that we are now at a place where we could have an impact on the quality of life of the citizenry that we serve in a way that I never, you look back 20 years, I mean, you always wish that you could provide service at a greater level, but didn't have the budget or the technology to really make that possible. And then when you think about the economic competitiveness that the innovation it brings to us, that affords us the ability to leverage what would otherwise be a fairly strapped budget and a pretty small team to do great things. And so that's one of the principal areas that I'm so excited about relative to our ability to address big issues with fairly lean staff and budget, considering what kind of technology innovations we're embracing now in city government and county government. So it's a very exciting time. And my last point would be that our ability to actually comprehend sustainability at that level, this idea that we may be able to really impact the citizen's life with city services that make a difference, and then the ability to be economically competitive. It's just a very exciting time. And to me, that I view that kind of as the framework for a lot of the smart solutions that I think you all are embracing. Those are, in my view, kind of the three tenets for standing up a cloud deployment. There's a story behind the story about why you even do that work. And I think it's motivated by those three factors, right? This idea of wanting to create a better life for our citizens, this idea that we want to be economically competitive, and the idea that we want to sustain that level of engagement and success for many, many years. And so we've got to build an infrastructure that has the capacity to support those values. And I think those values are shared not only by the IT experts that we have in the room here today, but I think and other administrative staff that may be joining us that are not necessarily IT. I think that's a commonality across the organizations that we serve. And I think the more that we can centralize those ideals so that we have a stronger cross-organizational strategy for, it's not IT alone, right? I mean, we've got to do this with other folks in our organizations. The more successful I think we're going to be. I mean, just some opening remarks. I'll send it over to Ron.
Well, good afternoon. Yeah, good. Absolutely. Ron Chandler, and I, and as Tom mentioned, in my previous life, only 2.5 years ago, as the CIO of Los Angeles Unified, we certainly had our challenges around security, and I'm seeing a lot of sort of the large-scale issues with security now. I'm also just floored by the rapid growth in just the number of bad things that are happening. And so, and I'm also floored by the, less than, optimal response to that by, CIOs and other administrators. So one of the things that we talk about is how the expectations of citizens, how the expectations of others who utilize our services are so much higher than where we are. And as they continue to consume our services, consume data, and use technology, we have to do a better job of providing IT for them. And so they're expecting it from us. So I'm just really bothered by that, but I'm also bothered and energized by the fact that we're having this conversation. And I was sharing with the gentleman earlier, one of the things we had happen at LAUSD was, how many of you are familiar with the hacktivist group called Anonymous? Right? We all kind of know those. And so we got a call from them, an email from them, and saying they were going to take our network down and our systems down at LAUSD on April 1st, April Fool's Day. And so, of course, we all panicked. We had a CISO, and we had a plan of attack, and we just were not ready for that. And so we brought a company in to help us do forensics and to find out what can we do at the last minute, right, to try to ward this off. And turns out that they were already in our system. They had been in our system for 3 months. And so that's why they were so, so confident that they were going to be able to do this. And so, I often say that you have two types of organizations, right? Those that have been breached and know about it, and those that have been breached and don't know about it. And so how do we, as IT administrators, as IT professionals, how do we bring along the organization to prepare for this and certainly mitigate any of the bad stuff that's from happening? And then after it does happen, how do we recover quickly? And so that's really what my conversation has been about, and why I'm excited to be an advisor for iBoss, because they entertain that conversation. It's going to happen. We can do what we need to do. We need to do what we need to do to be prepared for that. So with that, I don't know how you want to just dive right into. Yeah, let's do that. So I think one of the things that we talk about, and some of this probably won't be new to some of you or all of you, but the conversation is really what's happening in the industry now. And so, and this goes across all industries. And I know that both from working both in K-12 and higher ed, and by way of admission, my wife is a deputy treasurer of LA County. And so we're really familiar with county government, and I have friends and colleagues in state and local. We're all dealing with the same things, right? We're dealing with these issues, these industry trends and growth around the fact that more people are working remotely, more people are off the campus. And so I just instituted a policy even at UCLA that you can, in my organization, you can work off campus as much as you want. And so part of that is we're building so many buildings on campus now. It's so noisy that it's hard for people to kind of come in, and many people commute ridiculous lengths to get to the campus. So, but it's kind of rare that in higher ed, and certainly even in city government and state government and local and county, a lot of this is happening more. Device proliferation, that goes without saying. I mean, we used to always talk about being prepared for one-to-one, one device per student, in a classroom. And now we're talking about 3 and 4 to 1. And so the same thing, I remember when, Randy over in the city of LA was, moving some of her operations to the cloud, and how that was like, one of the biggest things that could have happened, and it was so ridiculously complex and political, but it's happening, right? People are walking around with more technology on their hips now than many people had in the office buildings years ago, and that's not going to change, right? Bandwidth boom, it's about consumption, and it's about making sure that we consider bandwidth like a utility. When I go up to the faucet and turn the faucet, I want water to come out. And we consider that, we consider bandwidth the same way. We have expectations that I'm going to consume as much as I need, and it's going to be available. SaaS, this one is the one that still, in some ways, as a CIO, scares me, but then as an advisor, doesn't scare me as much. The assumption is that we have to get more comfortable and continue to grow comfortable with the fact that we're going to have data that doesn't live in our physical space. And that's going to continue to happen. Our clients, our users, those who advise us will say that this is only going to grow. And what we're seeing happening pretty regularly in all industries is that within your organization, people are buying these services. They pull out a credit card and they order whatever they order, whether it's Salesforce or whatever. They don't have to go through IT anymore. And so the challenge is our data now lives in places we don't know. And so that's not going to change. And then really this whole conversation about, we call it hybrid arrangements, where you have some data on-prem and some data off in the cloud. And how do you live through those various states of a hybrid state? And so gone are the days, many days, where you have, on a scale, 0% of your data, all sort of 0% of your data on the cloud and 100% on-prem. And we're not at the days where you're ever going to see 100% of the data on the cloud and 0% on-prem. And so the states that you live in that hybrid spectrum, is what I'm always concerned about. How do you manage the data and the systems within those data, the data within those systems, so that they work well together? So that's really what we talk about in terms of consolidating data. And so I know I'm kind of just flying off the handle here, Tom, but
Yeah, and I'm asleep at the wheel. I was just mesmerized, but
so, yeah, and so yeah. And so I kind of talked on this, is that, workforce decentralization. I mean, it's good for, businesses and other organizations, but it's just really tough on security. And it's just tough to get our arms and keep our arms around what's happening with our data. And, I see it now. I saw it in my other organization, and all my, the rest of my colleagues, when I talk to on a regular basis, you just don't always know where your data is. And that's not really a good position or a comfortable position to be in. So I don't know that I'm going to, you can just kind of walk me through. But in terms of, we talked about, device proliferation, it's everywhere. And so my concern now is not only how do we know where the devices are, but how do we know where the data that resides on those devices, are. And that's one of the things we regularly have to talk about. Bandwidth, I won't talk about that. I think I've touched on that. SaaS, I touched on that. And then data system consolidations, we could just kind of step through that. So
just to provide a little more, even more context, Ron, thanks. That overview is excellent. So, I know that smart city initiatives are at the forefront for a lot of you now. And the areas that are considered to be the domains, include the environment and, building out systems that are sensitive to that, and education and security and mobility. These are all, core tenets associated with a smart city deployment. And you're trying to get at all those issues, including, the economy and just the standard of living for your citizenry. And all of those are contributing factors for when you think about smart cities. So I'd like to narrow it down just a bit, not to fixate, but to just associate the smart city challenges that we face as it relates to the cloud computing and definitely security in the cloud. And so as Ron mentioned, I'd just like to circle back very quick and say, Right now, relative to the kind of solutions that we see in other verticals within the SLED space, there's a great deal of limited sophistication with respect to not just the technology, but also the practice, the actual human aspect, the behavioral component relative to training and preparing folks. I think about and become very concerned for all of us when I think about incident response teams. You know, if you are breached, you know, what are you going to do? You know, I mean, and so a lot of my colleagues, and I'm sure that's the case with you, that's a looming question in terms of what is the incident response strategy relative to a DDoS attack, or you know, what happens when you find out that you've been infiltrated and you've found an anomaly across your network whereby, you know, data is being exfiltrated. What do you do? And so it is my expectation that, you know, my city manager or city council members, mayor, would look to me for some answers. And I think this is kind of the jumping off point about this idea that I alluded to as it relates to, you know, all these components that Ron covered relative to an action plan that includes not just myself, but other people as well that are sitting around the cabinet table, which is, you know, I think critically important from a strategic point of view. So let me just sum it up, and we'll progress forward. And really, I'm speaking to my colleagues. So I mean, I certainly don't have all the answers. You probably have more answers than I do in some respects. But this is a collective effort. So to the extent that you feel comfortable, you know, raising issues or, you know, interacting, by all means, do so. But just from my point of view, I'm pretty passionate about this work, and what concerns me is the lack, again, of sophistication relative to not just our technology solutions, but also, of course, our human capacity. So as it relates to the idea that, you know, we are now a distributed entity, highly distributed, we've always been distributed. We've always had transportation over there, and we had licensing, you know, maybe based down the street, and you know, and departments are very decentralized. But the connectivity issue and the requirements to push from each one of those decentralized departments out to the citizenry, that whole architecture has changed dramatically now, okay? It's not people going to the licensing department, knocking on the door and sitting and waiting in the lobby for 3 hours. Now there's an expectation that you're going to engage those services online, which really positions that department very differently from a technology point of view, and also from a behavioral point of view relative to that staff's capacity to support that expectation that the citizens have. And so, you know, the distributed aspect, I want a solution, and this is not a commercial, as much as it is a concern. I want to know that I can have my folks, my team, my city family, you know, be able to access the cloud very easily. So if they're at home, as Ron mentioned, they should be able to go direct to cloud and have that same level of confidence relative to security that they would if they were plugged into the network in their office. It's got to be the same. I've got to know that I can push policy that is essentially policy that would be inline, internal policy, I should say, that I can have the level of sophistication with my solution where I can push the same policy to folks that are sitting at a Best Buy. And in fact, I want the agility to push policy that might be a little different than the policy I'm pushing internally. And so this idea, I don't want to backhaul. I just don't want to do it. I don't want to backhaul my data back to central office, to my data center, and then provision the security out that way. I want to provision security through the cloud, direct to cloud. That's kind of one of my prerequisites from a CTO point of view. So that and then the mobility piece, and I'm not going to go over all the boxes. I think Ron handled that perfectly, but I just wanted to accentuate a couple of areas. Mobility. I mean, today now more than ever, the expectation is access anytime, everywhere. It's a term that's used in K-12 significantly. I mean, think about K-12. I mean, you folks have been tuned to support the citizenry of your communities, which are hundreds of thousands, tens to hundreds of thousands of folks. But K-12, I mean, the last mile, just a few years back, was a single delivery internet connectivity into the classroom. That's it. And now you're looking at maybe 25 students concurrently hitting the network, multiplied by hundreds of classrooms. In Ron's case, over 800 school sites. So scalability and mobility have to be fundamental to a solution that you embrace. It's just got to be something that's factored into your strategy, along with, of course, a cross-organizational effort. So I'm just kind of taking broad strokes here and also trying to mine in a little bit around some of Ron's great comments. So we can advance to the next slide, I think. And so what we thought would be beneficial for this discussion, and I'll pivot back to Ron, is we put together this challenges and benefits list that we thought was informative in terms of the kinds of challenges you're facing today as it relates to embracing the cloud, and then the kind of benefits that you can experience as well. So, I mean, hybrid IT infrastructure. I think Ron spoke to that. Thanks, Ron. When you get past 50, you gotta. This hybrid infrastructure environment is absolutely the right, kind of environment to be thinking about relative to going all in, which is kind of synonymous with the title of this presentation. Look before you leap. Take steps incrementally to move to the cloud. Some of you are probably there. I mean, I know my first cloud experience was Office 365, right? It was certainly getting off that Active Directory server farm and moving that to the cloud. Many of you probably have had the same experience where, having a senior engineer or multiple senior engineers, focused on your AD environment and overseeing that evaporated, as well as all the servers. So we're talking about a reduction in noise, including power and maintenance and all the other things that come along. So that was my first pivot to the cloud. But nonetheless, I think, and Ron can speak to this, you're not just deploying, in some instances, a Microsoft, Active Directory email environment, but you're also deploying Google. And you may have multiple flavors based on the complexion of your staff and their use of the technology. So you want to be agile to support those requirements and expectations. So my belief is you don't go all in. You do look at a hybrid solution. And the kind of solution that I'm thinking about when I think about a hybrid is I want to be inline. So I would like the gear to be inline to my network. I want to touch it. I want to feel it. I know a lot of my network colleagues who I worked with, they want to touch it. What do you mean it's in the cloud? No, I don't think so. They want to touch it, and then I want to be able to move strategically some things up to the cloud. Some things that I can easily interoperate, easily integrate into my overall deployment of IT services without staying awake at night. Email being one of those first things I think of. I mean, you want to just make this the first one?
Yeah, sure. No, so I like the conversation. I mean, we keep calling it hybrid, and I think that's the reality. We're going to live in that state, a hybrid state, for a long time. Migration requirements is a challenge in terms of how do you, when do you, where do I, and all those conversations about when do I start moving stuff. Am I okay with moving, my back office systems to the cloud, which typically brings people, the most angst, right? And then some of my front office or client-facing systems, typically you might be more apt to go to the cloud. So it's all that. Faulty integration, remediation. What happens when you actually go live on the cloud and you're not getting, it's not delivering the level of efficacy that you expected? Now what do? Do you roll back? And if you roll back, do you even own the data? Do you own the code? I mean, all these conversations really turn into a problem. Data protection, and we talked earlier about, where does your data live, and whose other data lives next to your data, right? So, because you no longer own the space if you move the stuff to the cloud, and so you want to make sure that it's containerized in a way that you're comfortable with, and that it's not it's not living next to, virtually, physically, if you will, next to someone who has poor data hygiene, right? You have to consider these things contractually. Quality service, uptime, SLAs. These are conversations you're going to have early on. And they, quite honestly, if you don't do them the right way, they can really cause faulty and really long-lasting issues. So we're concerned about that. Having said all that, we all know that there are huge benefits around pushing stuff to the cloud. Flexibility, scalability. We don't have the other agility that I like there, which is agility. it now turns your organization into one that's more agile. Resource management, I mean, we're all dealing with shrinking budgets, and in terms of your FTE numbers, those typically don't go up. If anything, they go down. And so how do you do more with less? And in many cases, you can manage your resources better by pushing stuff out to the cloud. I don't say, necessarily it's going to be a cost savings. In some cases, it will be, but not in all cases. But certainly, it allows you in some cases to simplify, as we say, simplify your budget. I'm not having to divide up my FTEs and pay for this person, not pay for that person 100% of the time. It's one bill I get from the provider. So we know, and this is really more of a level setting, the challenges and the benefits. I'm sure if any of these are new, or I'd be surprised to any of you. So it's really a level set, and then so that we can make sure that we're on the same conversation. And then really the next piece, you want to talk a little bit about that, Tom?
Yeah, and so we bubbled it up to just kind of our top three for the security considerations, starting with just general strategy, like where do you begin, and then from there the actual integration process, and then ultimately just kind of what does that architecture look like when it's fully implemented. And so I know that as a account executive and speaking with customers, I'm out in the field. Oftentimes, the first person I speak with is an administrator who's actually hands-on. They're behind this, and it's their job to execute this. And in some cases, they've had an initiative where, okay, no, we need to start moving certain services or X amount of services to the cloud. Go do it. And they come back and and say, well, we don't know what the heck's going on. And so we see that there's a gap there, and that's just from the IT leadership down to the administration, whereas we're not even talking about kind of looking laterally from department to department and other folks within the organization. So I kind of wanted to throw it back to you guys, and with that said, maybe any experience around that, or if you can elaborate at all.
Yeah, I think that in my case of working at LA County Office of Ed, we provided services to about 80 school districts and 5 community colleges, almost 2 million students overall. And I throw those numbers out there not to impress as much as to let you know that I did stay up at night. I just did, and it was not fun. There were times where I really enjoyed my job, but there were lots of times where I really was scared. And I just didn't know exactly what my footing was on a number of different things. What I learned fundamentally as a result of getting scared a lot is that I can't live like that, number one. My wife was just done with it. I'd come home and I couldn't sleep. I'm being just transparent and honest with you. It was not fun. And so I thought the best thing I could do is really begin developing more of a relationship with others who shared the same concerns I had, but from a different altitude or from a different point of view. And so what I found was that, number one, I really worked hard to find a seat at the table with my fellow colleagues who ran these departments. Because if I'm a service agency, essentially, to provide internal services to these various departments, I've got to be at the table when they're talking strategy and they're talking budget and they're talking priorities and vision. I've got to be there. And so, fortunate for me, I had a leader who was the county superintendent of schools who saw the brilliance, if you want to call it that, in getting IT at the table. And so I had the great benefit of being appointed the Chief Technology Officer for the LA County Office of Ed, and as a result of that, I had a seat at the table. And so when we had discussions about business resumption and business continuity and disaster recovery, there I was. When we had discussions about how do we back up systems and how do we support the growing number of mobile users, there I was. When we talked about delivering services to the 80 school districts beyond just of course, the legitimate mandated services that LACO was responsible for delivering, but in addition to that, entrepreneurial services like network assessments, the ability to help districts move to Office 365. We had certified teams that did that work. My point is to say, without going on, that you've got to develop a village. You can't do it on your own. And I think that too many of us in the IT space feel somewhat abandoned and isolated to the extent that we are kind of almost trapped in ourselves and speaking to ourselves. And the degree to which, one of the things I learned, by the way, of being on cabinet is how to talk normal, how to not make it technical, how to really break it down. And I tell you, it's an art. It really is, to simplify what is otherwise complex and technical. And so relative to strategy in terms of the kind of the issues that we're dealing with and addressing here, I would say the big takeaway for me is get to the table, talk plain English, and make friends.
And I'll talk a little bit about, I think my spin is really on the last point, which is make friends. And the conversation for me is absolutely, there's a gap, a chasm between the vision and implementation, what people expect versus what you can deliver, what you expect your SaaS providers to deliver versus what you want. And so I think for me, the conversation is, pulling it back to sort of a look before you leap is find out what your partners are doing. Find out what your like and similar organizations are doing, whether it's state, city, local, other industries, because my guess is that what they're doing, many of them are a little bit ahead of you, or a lot ahead of you, or some are behind you. And so I'm a really big proponent of sharing. And what I find is that you really are not in competition. And we're all trying to crack this egg together. And so my conversation is about, making friends in this place and finding out what they're doing. And even down to, what vendors are you using? What partners are you using? What solutions are you using? How are you using them? Because you want to get the best practices. And what you'll find is that people are pretty willing to share that with you. So that was really my notion around the chasm between, or gap between strategy and implementation.
Great, and then the next point is, okay, so now we've got a collective vision, hopefully. Now we actually have to figure out how we're going to get it in play. And so from the integration or the execution of that, we see that it's okay, we can do a lot of prep and then flip the switch as it relates to going to cloud and, spray and pray. Or, hopefully, if the solutions permit, can you take more of a phased approach? And so on one hand, I guess there's pros and cons to each, and kind of wanted to pass it back to you guys.
Well, I mean, to stay employed, you really do need to address the risk mitigation issue, and I'll just be frank about it. It's scary to pull the lever. It's easier to put in place various ways to remediate risk to the extent that you can. And so an open conversation with your colleagues, not just with yourself, of course, and your IT team, but other folks that are going to be the benefactors of this, embracing the direction you're going, is to really have an open discussion about what kind of risk is acceptable. And what you'll find in having that transparent conversation is that you walk away well-informed and typically, from my experience, almost a little surprised by what you find out. That what you were thinking was not necessarily the golden nugget for how to proceed, but that you didn't take certain things into consideration that you're sure glad that now that you have that information, you can. And so it really is about making sure that you cover yourself and you have those conversations. Relative to distributive, how distributive each approach is, I don't have too much to focus on there. I think that that what I'd rather focus on is what would the remediation process look like, because that is an area where, if you have not mitigated the risk and now you find yourself in a place where you have to roll back, to Ron's point, you've got to be able to roll back, most likely if you're in the cloud internally, you've got to come back to system. So I'm a big believer in whenever I run anything out and roll it live, I typically will roll out everything. I mean, I don't believe in doing anything where I'm cutting anything off and going it alone. I just don't do it. I mean, I know it may be costly to have two systems in parallel in production, but so be it. I'm a big believer in safety nets, and the one safety net I believe in, especially if you're embracing cloud, is a pivot back to your inline architecture and fall back on that. That's something that has saved my bacon many times. So I'll let you handle it.
That's fine, and I think in one of my last gigs, I didn't do that, and it roasted my bacon. And so, but it was a situation where we knew we needed to burn the bridge as we crossed it. And so, going into that decision, I knew that it was going to be one that was going to be pretty intense. I wrote down something, and this is interesting for me. It's always understand that the appetite for change in risk is not always equal to the level of tolerance for the change in risk. And so people will tell you, yes, we're good, we can make it happen, and if you make a few mistakes, that's okay. But you really need to understand what that means, because if and when things don't go well, are those same people going to be there to say you're okay? And so, and we know that. And so, again, going back to keeping with the theme of looking before you leap, these are the things you want to know up front. Like, so, how much risk can I tolerate? And if it comes down to things going wrong, what are the things you have to do to remediate? And I'm not talking about just technical stuff. I mean, you got to fix whatever's not working. But what do you have to do to prepare and repair the more softer things around people acceptance and motivation and budget and things like that? And it's also doing an analysis around not just cost, but what's more effective. And effective, by effective, I mean, if I'm spending $10, am I going to get 12 back? And so you have to know these, because you're going to be questioned should things go well, but you're certainly going to get questions if things don't go well. And it's about time management, and certainly in education, it's not so much about time management. I only have certain times of the year where I can put in big changes. Are there cycles in your areas as well that you want to take advantage of? So before you craft out your cloud migration strategy, these are some of the things you might want to consider. So
you can advance, Tom, if you don't mind. But I just real quick, one of the roadblocks I hit, and I didn't foresee it, was not really developing this. I did eventually, but I had not thought about the impact that some of the innovation I was embracing, particularly pivoting things to the cloud, would have on the average worker in my organization, who's, by the way, represented in my case by SEIU. And as a result, I ran into some pitfalls that were just very painful. And it was one of those, kept me up, because the political leverage that unions have is tremendous, and the degree to which they can really make it difficult for you goes without saying. I don't want to put Ron on the spot, but Ron has certainly had an amazing experience down that path. We can do 1 hour just on that, but let me just say quickly that, boy, I'll tell you, reach out to your union representatives and introduce the concepts that you're planning to deploy with them in mind, which includes having a conversation with them that's really straightforward and honest and transparent about what you're really trying to achieve in terms of bettering the quality of the work experience for all employees within the organization, not to mention the contribution back to the citizenry you serve. So I think that underscores a lot.
Right, and then wrapping up on the key points here, just looking at the actual design of the architecture once you're actually getting into the cloud, and really the whole idea of cloud in general is combining resources. It's shared server space, but as we think about that as it relates to security and kind of the cross-pollination of data, certainly some concerns around that, and so kind of wanted to just get your thoughts as it relates to security.
Yeah, I'll just stab at this quickly. I mean, the fact is, if you're on a smart city footing, and most of you are in one way or the other, your data collection is vacuous. I mean, there's just an amazing amount of data being collected, and those data sets vary tremendously, right? From capturing data from preschoolers to the elderly, who are accessing your senior resource centers across your city. And so my big thing is that you've got to be positioned to protect that data. Just because you are embracing a managed service provider doesn't mean that they necessarily maintain good data hygiene. And I think that it's kind of an overlooked assumption in many ways by many of us out there that, we've signed the contract, I don't want to name names, but 3 letters here, and, and you can conjure up who that might be relative to a cloud provider. And the fact is that we don't really know what's going on across the multiple data centers across the world in terms of their data hygiene. And so one of the things that I'm preoccupied with is this idea of where is my data residing, And is it really safe? And one of the things that I am a big believer in is an architecture, a cloud architecture that isolates my data from the rest. This idea, I think, is kind of captured in this little piece of context there to the right. I can't read it from here, but it addresses this idea that, I use the analogy that I want the keys to my own apartment in spite of the fact that I might be in a high-rise, and I want no one else to have the keys to that apartment. I don't want anyone else to get into my apartment with all my stuff. And so I want to be protected in an enterprise cloud environment to the extent where I can zone off my data and protect it without having to co-locate it or co-share it with other cloud users. Want to add it to that?
Not really. I mean, I think it's, you said it nicely. It's just this framework is one of many, but you should certainly consider all this before you leap, right? And so I know we're coming up on the hour, so I'll let Tom.
Well, and really, that's, I get, kind of to summarize all that, and here's kind of our final point. So, number one, obviously unify your government's view of cloud, and that goes from top to bottom and horizontally as well. So that cross-departmental collaboration is going to be critical, and be prepared and make friends in advance to be prepared for that. Choosing the right technology. We'd love to talk if time permits today. And then, consider a phased approach versus just kind of, a lot of prep and then flipping the switch and praying it all goes well. And then finally, obviously know your data and understand the cloud environments where it resides. So guys, any final thoughts before we wrap up here?
I'd like to hear a little bit about, our solution now, obviously, because I think it dovetails, without being commercial here, it dovetails with all the key recommendations that you outlined here. So look forward to hearing about that. Ron,
Yeah.
Did you have anything else?
Yeah, so just a quick little snippet about iBoss before we let you go. And of course, we've got a booth over there. We can certainly talk in more detail. But so we're in the secure web gateway space. And really, our goal is just to simplify the way you deliver and manage your security in your environment. Without getting into all the technical details, the architecture is built for the cloud, but we operate under the notion of a non-shared gateway. So within that cloud infrastructure, we're provisioning gateways for each individual customer. So there is no cross-pollination in that regard. And what that also does is enables us to provide our gateways in the physical form in your data center and your headquarters as well. So if you're looking for more of that phased approach, or if you want to kind of dip your toe in the water, maybe we want to start by securing mobile devices in the cloud, or maybe some remote branch offices, things like that. You can do so starting there and then ultimately growing it. So you're going to minimize your data center footprint immediately, and then you have a logical path to get there. But overall, we've been in business for over 10 years. We're a visionary on Gartner's Magic Quadrant, and I guess we do fall under the SaaS model, even though we offer gear that you can provide on site within your own data center. There's no CapEx to it. So again, from a budget perspective, very easy to forecast year over year. So again, that's just my 30-second spiel. And if there's any interest, or we'd love to talk more over at our booth.
Yeah, thank you so much for spending this time with us. Really enjoyed it, and feel free to come up and engage if you'd like. Are we?
Yep. Good.
Okay.
Good.
Thanks very much.